60 to 80,000 Ottoman soldiers, 6 to 7,000 Byzantine defenders, 69 cannons, a massive chain blocking the Golden Horn, and walls that had stopped armies for more than 1,000 years. May 28th, 1453, the 53rd night of the siege. Before those walls stood a 21-year-old sultan. One goal: to take Constantinople. To understand why the siege mattered, you have to understand what stood in front of Mehmed. Constantinople was not just another city on a map. It was the old capital of an empire that still called itself Roman. It stood between Europe and Asia, between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, between trade, religion, memory, and power. For centuries, armies had reached these walls and learned the same lesson. Surrounding Constantinople was possible. Taking it was something else. The land walls were not a single wall of stone. They were a defensive system built in layers. A moat came first, then an outer wall, then a higher inner wall, then towers, narrow passages, battlements, and killing zones designed to slow an attacking army before it could reach the city itself. This is why the Theodosian Walls became more than architecture. They became a belief that Constantinople could be wounded, starved, surrounded, and shaken, but not taken by force. By 1453, the city behind those walls was no longer at the height of its power. Its population had fallen. Some districts stood half empty. Gardens grew where crowded streets had once carried merchants, soldiers, priests, and officials. Great churches still rose above the skyline, but the empire around them had grown smaller with every generation. From a distance, Constantinople still looked eternal. From inside, it looked tired, but tired did not mean weak. The defenders understood what they were holding. Byzantine soldiers, local fighters, and experienced allies stood on damaged walls that had already suffered weeks of bombardment. When cannon fire broke stone during the day, men worked through the night to close the damage with earth, timber, barrels, rubble, and anything else they could carry. Every repair bought time. Every hour mattered. This was not a city waiting passively for its end. It was a city fighting to stay alive one night longer. That is what made the siege so difficult. Mehmed was not facing only stone. He was facing a system: walls, water, supply routes, repair crews, commanders, faith, fear, and the hope that help might still arrive from the sea. His advantage was not only the size of his army, it was the way he understood the problem. He did not look at Constantinople as one wall to break. He looked at it as a machine that had to be taken apart piece by piece. The walls had to be battered. The harbor had to be pressured. The sea routes had to be controlled. The defenders had to be exhausted. Their repairs had to be made useless. Their hope had to be reduced day after day until the city could no longer hold itself together. That was the real design of the siege. Not one attack, not one weapon. A sequence of pressures, each one forcing the next weakness to appear. But that final night did not appear suddenly. It was prepared. Pressure by pressure, decision by decision. Long before the last assault reached the walls, Mehmed was already reducing the city's options. The first target was not the wall, it was movement. As long as ships could move through the Bosphorus, Constantinople could still receive messages, supplies, soldiers, and perhaps outside help. A city that could still be reached from the sea was not fully isolated, and a siege that left the Bosphorus open was not yet complete. Mehmed did not need to control every mile of water. He needed to control the narrow point that mattered. On the European shore, opposite the older Anatolian fortress, he ordered a new stronghold to be built at one of the narrowest points of the Bosphorus. Rumeli Fortress. But Rumeli Fortress was not built only to watch the Bosphorus. It turned the narrow passage into a controlled firing line. At this point, the distance between the two shores was roughly 700 meters. For a passing ship, that waterway became a trap. The problem was not the weakness of Ottoman cannon, it was geometry. A ship was a moving target, and its hulls sat low on the water. A high shot could fall short, lose force in the sea, or pass above the target. Mehmed's solution used the surface of the water itself. The guns were placed low near the shore. Their stone balls were fired across the waterline, striking the surface and skipping forward like a stone thrown across a river. The cannonball did not need to cross the Bosphorus in a perfect arc. It could skim across the surface, carrying its force toward the body of the ship. A vessel passing Rumeli Fortress was no longer simply sailing through water. It was entering a line of impact. The Bosphorus itself had become part of Mehmed's weapon. Its purpose was direct. Watch the strait. Control the ships, cut the line between Constantinople and help coming from the Black Sea. From that moment, any ship approaching the city from the north would have to pass through Ottoman control before it could continue. This changed the siege before the main assault even began. The city had not fallen. The cannons had not yet opened the final breach. But one of Constantinople's most important routes was no longer free. The road to the final night began with isolation. Isolation had taken away one of Constantinople's greatest hopes. The Bosphorus was no longer an open road for help. But inside the city, one belief still remained. The walls had stopped armies before. They could stop this one too. That was the belief Mehmed had to break. He did not need another ordinary assault against the same ancient walls. He needed a machine beyond its age, a weapon that could change the distance between attacker and wall, a weapon that could strike before soldiers ever reached the battlements. That weapon was the basilica, the royal gun, a bronze monster, more than 8 meters from end to end, and close to 19 tons in weight. It was not simply a cannon, it was a siege machine, built to force the ancient walls to answer gunpowder. Its stone ball weighed more than half a ton. A single shot carried enough mass to turn distance into impact. This was the kind of force Constantinople had never faced in this form before. Urban, the Hungarian cannon founder, brought the knowledge to cast heavy guns. But knowledge alone did not move history. Mehmed gave that knowledge the power of a state. Bronze, workshops, craftsmen, gunpowder, Stone ammunition, transport, protection, time. All of it had to serve one purpose: put impossible weight in front of the Theodosian Walls and make it fire. Before the basilica ever struck the city, moving it became a campaign of its own. 60 oxen and hundreds of men dragged the 19-ton machine toward Constantinople. Slowly, step by step. This was not speed. This was organized pressure. Mehmed was not adding one more weapon to the siege. He was changing the problem itself. For centuries, the danger had been men reaching the walls. Now the danger could arrive from beyond the reach of swords, ladders, arrows, and hands. When the basilica faced the walls, the old distance between army and fortification changed. The first shots did not end the siege in a single moment, but they proved what mattered. The walls could be reached. The fortifications could be damaged. The same damage could return. One impact could be repaired. A second could be managed. But day after day, the same force came back. Every shot created work. Every crack demanded material. Every repair consumed time. That was the power of the basilica. Not one perfect explosion. A 19-ton machine turning repetition into fear. The defenders still fought. They still repaired what they could. But they were no longer facing only soldiers outside the city. They were facing Mehmed's system. Isolation on the water, pressure at the walls, and the basilica, forcing the ancient walls to answer again and again. The Bosphorus had weakened the city's hope of help. The basilica began to weaken its faith in the walls. Constantinople was not a city defended by walls alone. Even while the basilica began to test the strength of the land walls, another line of defense still protected the city from the north: the Golden Horn. This narrow, sheltered harbor was one of the last places where the city could still breathe. Ships could wait inside it. Supplies could gather there, and messages from the outside world could still carry the promise that Constantinople was not completely alone. For the defenders, the Golden Horn was more than water. It was shelter, movement, communication, and hope. As long as that harbor remained protected, the siege was not yet complete. But the entrance to the Golden Horn was sealed by one of the city's most important defenses, the Great Chain. It did not have to destroy ships to be effective. It did not need to burn sails, sink hulls, or win a battle at sea. Its purpose was simpler, and in many ways more powerful. It denied passage. A chain stretched across the water turned a harbor into a locked gate. Behind it, Byzantine and Allied ships could remain protected. In front of it, Mehmed's fleet could advance no farther. Even approaching the chain was not simple. More than once, Ottoman vessels tried to press toward the entrance, but the iron line was never left unguarded. Byzantine and Allied ships protected the barrier, forcing Mehmed's fleet back before it could even touch the chain itself. That was the chain's true strategic value. Constantinople did not need to win a naval war. It only needed to preserve the distance. Mehmed understood what this meant. On land, the basilica had changed distance, allowing him to strike the walls before his soldiers could reach them. At sea, the chain did the opposite. It kept the Ottoman fleet outside the harbor and kept the defenders' last northern refuge alive. A conventional commander might have spent ships and men attacking that iron line again and again, trying to break it by force. Mehmed looked for a different weakness, not in the chain itself, but in the assumption behind it. The chain could stop ships on water, It could not stop them from moving another way. So Mehmed did not prepare only to break the barrier. He prepared to make it irrelevant. If the Golden Horn could not be entered from the sea, then the road to it would have to be built over land. The chain still held. But now, Mehmed was no longer thinking only about the chain. He was analyzing the space around it. The defenders had built their confidence on one simple assumption: ships belonged to water. A fleet could be blocked if the water was blocked. A harbor could be protected if its entrance was sealed. It was a reasonable assumption, and that was exactly why Mehmed chose to attack it. If the Ottoman fleet could not sail into the Golden Horn, then part of that fleet would have to leave the water entirely. The idea sounded unnatural because it was. Ships were engineered to float, not to climb. Their hulls belonged to currents, not hills. Their weight belonged to harbors, ropes, and waves, not to mud, timber, and slopes. But a siege does not reward what feels natural. It rewards what changes the problem. The operation belonged to the night. Not because the work was small, but because it had to remain entirely unseen. As darkness settled over the Ottoman lines, tactical theory shifted into absolute execution. There was no room for confusion, no room for a single mistake. While the defenders kept their eyes fixed on the water, Mehmed was re-engineering the land. Through the shadows, the hidden road had to take shape before dawn could reveal the movement. The first vessels needed to be close enough to descend toward the Golden Horn before the sun broke the horizon. Behind the Ottoman lines, this preparation became an act of cold precision. Massive wooden rollers were brought together across the Galata route. Heavy timber tracks were shaped into a calculated road, heavily coated with grease and animal fat to reduce friction. Ropes were tightened. Teams of hundreds of men, sailors, and animals took their synchronized positions around each vessel, moving together like a single massive machine. This was not a blind assault. It was brutal engineering under pressure. Every movement demanded control. If a ship tilted too far, its hull could crack. If the ground failed, the operation could stop. If the defenders understood the plan too early, surprise could die before the first vessel reached the other side. Through the pale haze of the pre-dawn hours, the crews dragged the wooden hulls out of the water and up the steep slopes. Slowly, the ships moved over greased timber, not sailing, not floating, climbing. A warship on dry land is a terrifying, unnatural sight. It looks fundamentally wrong, and that was its tactical power. The defenders expected pressure at the mouth of the harbor, waiting for Mehmed to spend his strength against the iron chain. Instead, the ships moved where the chain could never reach them. Not through the locked gate, around it, over the hills. By morning, the geometry of the Golden Horn had changed. The chain remained intact. The iron still stretched across the water. The entrance was still sealed. Yet Ottoman ships had appeared inside the strategic space the chain had been built to protect. This did not end the siege, but it struck something deeper than stone. The defenders' sense of safety. The harbor that had promised shelter now carried danger. The chain had not been broken, but its certainty had been damaged. That was Mehmed's method. Not always to destroy the obstacle in front of him. Sometimes to move the battlefield somewhere. The obstacle no longer mattered. The Golden Horn had been closed by iron. Mehmed answered with wood, rope, grease, labor, and a road that should not have existed. The appearance of Ottoman ships inside the Golden Horn was a devastating psychological blow. But the defenders did not simply surrender the harbor. On the night of April 28th, a daring counterattack was launched. Led by the Venetian captain Giacomo Cocco, a small force moved into the dark waters with one desperate objective: burn the Ottoman vessels before their presence inside the Golden Horn became permanent. But the raid did not meet an unprepared enemy. As Cocco's galley advanced through the heavy mist, Ottoman shore artillery opened fire. A stone projectile struck the hull with crushing force. Wood split. Water rushed in, and the vessel disappeared into the darkness of the harbor. The failure was more than a tactical loss. It was a psychological verdict. The Golden Horn was no longer a sanctuary. It was a new front line. The city had not physically changed, but for the defenders, the space that still felt safe was beginning to shrink. After the failed raid in the Golden Horn, the siege did not pause. May dragged on. Above the earth, the land walls still answered the endless bombardment. But beneath the heavy soil, another war was beginning. Ottoman miners drove narrow shafts toward the foundations of the walls. Their objective was invisible: reach the base of the defenses, weaken the ground beneath the towers, and make stone collapse without a single soldier climbing over it. But Constantinople was also defended from the dark. Engineers, including Johannes Grant, listened to the earth. Small vibrations, hollow sounds, and movement beneath the ground betrayed the approaching tunnels. Counter-tunnels were cut. In the blackness below the walls, the siege became close, blind, and suffocating. Smoke filled the narrow gaps. Timber supports cracked. Water and fire turned passages into traps. Earth collapsed. Men vanished beneath the same ground they had tried to conquer. Mehmed had tested the stones. He had tested the waters. Now he had tested the soil. Still, the city held. The siege was no longer only a matter of method. It was becoming a race against time. By the final days of May, Mehmed had tested every edge of the city. The Bosphorus had been controlled. The walls had been battered. Ships had entered the Golden Horn. Even the earth beneath Constantinople had been opened. Still, the city had not fallen, and time was no longer neutral. Reports from the western frontiers reached the Ottoman camp. Rumors of movement from the Hungarian direction began to weigh on the command. Inside the council, caution and attack stood against each other. Chandarli Halil Pasha saw the danger of a siege that lasted too long. Zaganos Pasha saw a city already close to breaking. Mehmed listened, not as a prince chasing glory, but as a ruler measuring risk. To wait was dangerous. To withdraw was defeat. To strike was a gamble. But every part of the siege had led to this moment. The order was given. The army would prepare for one final assault, and Constantinople was carried into its last night. May 28th, 1453, the 53rd night of the siege. As darkness fell over the land walls, the landscape split into two opposite worlds. Outside the fortifications, the Ottoman camp glowed with the light of thousands of torches. Then the order passed through the camp. The lights went out. Fires died. Before the final assault, the army turned inward. Men bowed in prayer. In the darkness, soldiers asked God for strength, courage, and victory. Mehmed stood among his commanders, carrying the silence of a ruler who believed the conquest was more than a military prize. It was a duty before history and before God. Inside the city, bells moved slowly through the night air. Under the massive dome of Hagia Sophia, old divisions became smaller beneath a single shared fear. Priests, soldiers, and civilians stood side by side, facing the same inevitable dawn. On the battlements, exhausted defenders looked out into the darkness. They could no longer see the army clearly, but they could feel it waiting. The night was holding its breath, and the storm was about to break. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, before dawn, the silence broke. War drums rolled across the plain. Horns cut through the darkness. From the Ottoman lines, the first assault wave surged toward the land walls. These were not the final troops of the empire. They were the opening pressure. Light infantry, volunteers, and irregular fighters rushed forward, carrying ladders, shields, ropes, and hooks. Their task was brutal and clear. Force the defenders to wake into chaos, draw arrows, test the broken places, fill the killing zones with movement, and make the walls spend strength before the main blow arrived. Above them, the defenders answered from the battlements. Stones fell, arrows struck, fire flashed in the dark. Ladders slammed against damaged stone. Men climbed. Men were pushed back. Every yard of earth became noise, smoke, and fear. The first wave was not meant to end the siege. It was meant to exhaust the city, to pull the defenders toward every threatened point, to make the night feel endless. And while Constantinople fought the first storm, Mehmed held the stronger force behind it, waiting. Because the final assault had begun, but the final hand had not yet been played. The first wave had done its work. It had not broken the walls. It had broken time. The defenders had been pulled from tower to tower, breach to breach, ladder to ladder. Every shout demanded an answer. Every shadow looked like another attack. Before the city could recover, the pressure came again. A second wave moved forward through the darkness. Heavier men, better armed, more disciplined. They advanced over ground already covered with broken ladders, fallen shields, and bodies from the first assault. The walls answered again, but each answer cost strength. Arms grew tired. Voices grew hoarse. Stones had to be lifted. Arrows had to be drawn. Wounded men had to be moved away from the fighting line. And still the attackers came. The night no longer felt like a single battle. It felt like a machine. One wave struck. Another followed. Then another waited behind it. Mehmed was not only attacking the walls, he was attacking the defenders' endurance. By the final hours before dawn, Constantinople was still standing. But the men on its walls were no longer fighting only the Ottoman army. They were fighting exhaustion, confusion, darkness, and the fear that the strongest blow had not yet arrived. By the final hour before dawn, the walls were still standing, but the rhythm of the battle had changed. The defenders had spent their strength answering everything at once. Then Mehmed released the force he had kept behind the storm. The Janissaries moved forward, not as a crowd, as a disciplined wall of men. Drums beat behind them. Commanders held the lines in order. Shields rose. Ladders lifted. The strongest blow of the siege was now moving toward the weakest places of the wall. At the battered land walls, the fighting tightened. No space. No silence. No time to think. The defenders cut ladders down. The Janissaries raised more. Then, as the first gray light of dawn broke through the smoke, the defense lost one of the men holding it together. Giovanni Giustiniani, one of the defense's most important commanders, was wounded. As he was carried away from the battlements, confidence fractured along the wall. Orders slowed. Fear moved faster. The city did not collapse in a single moment. It began to lose control of the edges. A ladder held. A foothold lasted longer than before. The wall was no longer only being attacked, it was being overwhelmed. And somewhere inside that pressure, the final defense began to break. The break did not look like the fall of an empire at first. It looked smaller, a ladder that stayed in place, a foothold that could not be cleared, a few attackers reaching the broken edge of the wall and not being thrown back. But in a siege, small openings become disasters when no one has the strength left to close them. More Ottoman soldiers climbed into the same pressure point. The defenders rushed to contain it, but the line had already lost its rhythm. Some men fought forward, some looked behind them, some waited for orders that arrived too late. The wounded were being carried away. Commanders shouted through smoke, dust, and dawn light, and the wall that had held for 53 nights could no longer answer as one body. The breach widened. The struggle moved from the outside face of the wall to the top of the defenses, then from the top of the defenses toward the passages behind them. The Ottomans were no longer only attacking the city. They were entering its defensive system. Inside Constantinople, the sound changed. It was no longer only the sound of battle outside the walls. It was the sound of the walls failing from within. Still, the city was not silent. Defenders resisted where they could. Men rallied in broken groups. The last pockets of resistance tried to hold streets, gates, and inner approaches. But the shape of the battle had changed. The question was no longer whether the walls could survive. The question was how long the city behind them could keep fighting after they had opened. Constantinople had protected itself for centuries behind stone. Now the stone had been crossed, and the final morning of the city had begun. As the defensive line opened, the battle moved beyond the wall. For the defenders, there was no longer a single front. There were fragments, a gate, a passage, a broken tower, a street behind the walls. In that confusion, Emperor Constantine XI faced the end of more than his own reign. He was the last ruler of an empire that had once called the Mediterranean its center. Now that empire had been reduced to a city, and the city was breaking around him. The details of his final moments would pass into memory, rumor, and legend. But the meaning of the moment was clear. The emperor did not leave the city. He did not watch its fall from a distance. He remained inside the collapse. Somewhere in the fighting near the broken defenses, the last Roman emperor disappeared into the battle. No ceremony, no throne, no imperial procession, only smoke, steel, panic, and stone. Constantinople was losing more than walls. It was losing the last living symbol of the empire that had built them. Once the defenses opened, the battle changed faster than anyone inside the city could control. Ottoman soldiers pushed through the broken approaches. More men followed behind them. The defenders tried to form new lines. But the old order of the city had already been shattered. Messages failed. Groups became separated. Some men fought where they stood. Others fell back into the streets. The sound of battle moved inward, from the walls to the gates, to the passages behind them, to the city itself. For 53 nights, Constantinople had survived by keeping the enemy outside. Now the enemy was inside the defensive system. That was the real end of the siege. Not a single gate, not one legend, not one perfect breach, but the moment when the city could no longer decide where the battle was. Resistance did not vanish immediately. It broke into pieces. Small groups still fought, others searched for safety. Civilians fled through streets that had once felt protected by stone. But the direction of history had changed. The city that had resisted emperors, armies, sieges, and centuries of fear was finally being overwhelmed. By morning, Constantinople was no longer only under attack, it was falling. When Mehmed entered Constantinople, he did not enter an ordinary conquered city. He entered the capital of a memory. For centuries, this place had carried the name of Rome in the East. Its walls had shaped the imagination of kings. Its churches had held imperial ceremonies. Its harbor had connected worlds. Now the young sultan walked into the city he had refused to treat as impossible. The victory was military, but its meaning was larger than the battlefield. Inside the city, the great church of Hagia Sophia still stood. Its dome had watched emperors crowned, prayers whispered, and empires weakened. Now it stood before a new ruler. Mehmed understood the weight of what he had taken. This was not only stone, not only streets, not only a prize of war, it was legitimacy, capital, empire. The city that had resisted him became the city from which he would rule. Constantinople did not disappear. It was transformed. The center of a fallen empire became the heart of a rising one. The fall of Constantinople did not end the world, but it changed the way the world imagined power. For the Byzantines, it was the end of the empire that had survived in the East for more than 1,000 years. For Mehmed, it was the beginning of a new imperial claim. He had not taken the city by one weapon alone, not by one assault, not by one accident. He had taken it by pressure, isolation, artillery, engineering, night operations, relentless waves, and the ability to see every obstacle as part of a larger system. The Bosphorus had been controlled. The walls had been battered. The Golden Horn had been bypassed. The earth beneath the city had been opened. The defenders had been exhausted. And finally, the city had been entered. On May 29th, 1453, Constantinople passed from one age into another. The Roman world in the east reached its final morning, and from its stones, Mehmed built the capital of an empire that would shape centuries to come. The walls had stood for 1,000 years, but in the end, Mehmed did not defeat only the walls. He defeated the belief that they could never fall.